At the end of his life, Sammy Davis Jr. could no longer sing, joke, or even speak without pain. The man who once lit up stages across Las Vegas was now spending his final days in silence inside a hospital room. But while friends and family came and went, there was one face he still hadn't seen: Frank Sinatra. And when Sinatra finally found the courage to visit his dying friend, the emotional goodbye that followed revealed a side of both legends the public almost never got to witness. The illusion of a perfect childhood. Sammy Davis Jr. didn't discover show business later in life. He was born right into the middle of it. Entertainment was already running through his blood before he could even form full sentences. His mother, Elvira Sanchez, danced in the chorus line at Harlem's famous Apollo Theater, while his father, Sammy Davis Sr., spent his life traveling the vaudeville circuit as a performer. The stage wasn't just part of the family business, it was the family itself. So almost as soon as Sammy could stand on his own 2 feet, he was pushed under the bright lights alongside the adults. As a toddler, he could barely speak clearly, but audiences couldn't get enough of him. He'd walk out on stage making goofy expressions, clowning around, and somehow stealing attention from grown entertainers who'd spent years trying to master their craft. People saw an adorable little kid with natural charm. What they didn't see was a family already starting to crack apart behind the curtain. When Sammy was only 3 years old, his parents divorced. His father immediately went back on the road because vaudeville was the only life he knew. But there was no way he was leaving his son behind. Sammy Sr. took custody and carried the little boy with him from city to city, theater to theater, living out of hotels, train stations, and backstage dressing rooms. By the age of 4, Sammy Jr. had already performed in more than 50 cities. To him, it felt magical. Every night brought applause, music, laughter, and another packed crowd waiting to be entertained. He loved every second of it. What he didn't realize was that his father and Will Maston were carefully shielding him from the ugliness waiting outside those theater doors. They protected him from the racism surrounding them as best they could, trying to preserve the innocence of a child growing up in a deeply divided America. That illusion didn't survive the Army. In 1944, at just 18 years old, Sammy Davis Jr. was drafted into the military during World War II. Suddenly, the kid who had spent his whole life performing for audiences found himself trapped inside one of the harshest environments imaginable, the Army's 1st Integrated Infantry Unit. The transition was brutal. Many of the white soldiers around him, especially men from the segregated South, tormented him relentlessly. Sammy weighed barely 120 pounds, but he found himself fighting almost daily just to survive. The beatings became so frequent that his nose was broken multiple times, permanently changing the shape of his face and leaving him with the flattened nose people would later recognize around the world. But the physical violence was only part of the nightmare. Some soldiers went out of their way to humiliate him. In one horrifying incident, they pinned him down and painted his skin white. Another time, they tricked him into drinking beer that had been contaminated with urine. The cruelty was constant, calculated, and impossible to ignore. For the first time in his life, Sammy truly understood what his father had spent years trying to protect him from. All those moments when people acted cold or hateful toward him weren't because they were jealous of his talent. The world itself was stacked against him. That realization could have destroyed him. Instead, it transformed him. Somewhere in the middle of all that humiliation and violence, Sammy made a decision. If the world insisted on seeing him as less than human, then he would force the world to recognize his brilliance. He was going to become so talented, so magnetic, so undeniable that nobody could look away. When he returned to show business in 1945, he came back carrying a completely different energy. The innocence was gone. In its place was a relentless hunger to prove himself. That hunger exploded onto the Hollywood scene in 1951 when the Will Maston Trio landed a booking at the legendary Kairos nightclub in Los Angeles. At first, they were only scheduled to perform a quick 20-minute opening set. But once Sammy hit the stage, the entire room changed. Sitting in the crowd was a who's who of Hollywood royalty, and Sammy knew this was the kind of moment that could change a life forever. So he gave them everything. He danced, joked, sang, and rolled through impression after impression with unbelievable energy. The celebrities in the audience went crazy for him. Applause kept interrupting the act, and the crowd refused to let the trio leave the stage. What was supposed to be a short performance stretched into nearly an hour. That night became Sammy Davis Jr.'s true introduction to Hollywood. After years of grinding through small venues and vaudeville theaters, he had finally arrived, and suddenly everything started moving fast. By 1953, ABC offered him his own television show, an unbelievable opportunity for a performer who had spent most of his life working small stages. A pilot episode was filmed, and it looked like Sammy was on the verge of becoming a national television star. But America still wasn't ready. Advertisers refused to sponsor a program built around an unknown black entertainer, and the network quietly scrapped the entire project before it ever aired. Just like that, his breakthrough disappeared. It was a crushing setback. But compared to what was coming next, a canceled television show would soon feel insignificant. Ironically, life with the Will Mastin Trio had never looked brighter. After decades of scraping by, they finally landed a lucrative headlining residency at the New Frontier Casino in Las Vegas, earning an incredible $7,500 a week. Even more meaningful than the money was what the opportunity represented. For years, black entertainers were good enough to perform for white audiences, but not good enough to sleep in the same hotels. Sammy, his father, and Will Mastin often had to leave fancy casinos after their performances and stay in segregated black neighborhoods across town. But the New Frontier broke tradition and gave them suites inside the hotel itself. It felt like the barriers that had limited them their entire lives were finally beginning to crack. That's when disaster hit. Wanting to celebrate their success and show gratitude to the young man carrying the act into a new era, Sammy Davis Sr. and Will Mastin surprised Sammy with a brand new Cadillac. His initials were even painted onto the passenger side door. It should have been a joyful moment. Instead, the car would nearly destroy his future. The day before an important recording session in Los Angeles, Sammy spent the night doing what he loved most: performing, gambling, drinking, and entertaining crowds in Las Vegas. The next morning, he climbed into his brand new Cadillac and sped down Route 66, feeling unstoppable. Then, without warning, another driver suddenly swung into his lane while attempting a U-turn. There was no time to avoid the collision. The crash was catastrophic. In the immediate aftermath, Sammy wasn't even thinking about himself. His first concern was his assistant, Charlie, who had been riding alongside him. Sammy stumbled from the wreckage and found Charlie horribly injured, blood pouring from his face. But when Charlie looked at Sammy, his expression turned to pure horror. Confused, Sammy reached toward his own face. That's when he realized his left eyeball was hanging out of its socket. During the impact, his face had slammed directly into the Cadillac's decorative bullet-shaped horn mounted in the center of the steering wheel. The design was so dangerous that Cadillac later changed future steering wheels because of the accident. But for Sammy, the damage had already been done. Panicking, he tried to push the eye back into place himself. It was hopeless. He permanently lost his left eye. The physical pain was unbearable, but the emotional terror ran even deeper. Sammy's entire identity revolved around movement, rhythm, balance, and performance. Dancing under stage lights with one eye suddenly felt impossible. For the first time since childhood, he truly feared his career might be over. But Sammy Davis Jr. refused to surrender. While recovering, he forced himself to relearn his sense of balance from scratch. Day after day, he practiced routines, adjusted to his new depth perception, and slowly rebuilt his confidence. Then came the moment that proved just how respected he had become. When Sammy finally returned to the stage at Kairos, half of Hollywood showed up to support him. Stars like Cary Grant, Spencer Tracy, Gary Cooper, June Allison, and Frank Sinatra filled the audience, cheering him on as he stepped back into the spotlight. For Sammy, the moment meant everything. After a lifetime of fighting for acceptance, he finally felt embraced by the entertainment world he had devoted his entire life to. As the years passed, his talent grew too large to be contained within the old structure of the Will Mastin Trio. Sammy's father understood it immediately. The business was changing, and his son had become something bigger than vaudeville. Will Mastin struggled to accept that reality. Out of loyalty and love, Sammy continued using the name the Will Mastin Trio on marquees long after he became a solo superstar. But behind the scenes, the separation became painful. Will still traveled with him for a time, showing up at venues in full costume and makeup before every performance. He demanded his own dressing room because, technically, his name was still on the bill. But when the curtain rose each night, he never walked onto the stage anymore. Rise of the Rat Pack era. By the late 1950s, Sammy Davis Jr. had evolved into far more than just another entertainer. He was everywhere at once, dominating stages, filling casinos, climbing the music charts, and becoming one of the biggest stars in America. At the Sands Casino alone, he was reportedly pulling in $25,000 a week, an unbelievable amount of money at the time. His songs were blasting across radio stations nationwide, and television executives were once again circling around him after that earlier failed attempt at launching a TV career. Sammy wasn't just successful anymore. He was operating at the absolute peak of his powers. And standing right beside him was Frank Sinatra. Sinatra had admired Sammy's talent for years, but by 1959, their friendship had become something much bigger. Sammy was now officially part of Sinatra's inner circle, the legendary Rat Pack. Ironically, Sammy himself helped save the group from a name that could have become a public relations disaster. Sinatra originally wanted to call the crew the Klan, but Sammy, as the only black member of the group, quickly realized how dangerous that sounded in America during that era. The association with the Ku Klux Klan was impossible to ignore, and thankfully, Sinatra listened. The replacement name came almost by accident. One morning, actress Lauren Bacall walked in and saw Sinatra, Dean Martin, Sammy, and the rest of the crew looking completely exhausted after another all-night marathon of drinking, smoking, gambling, and poker. She looked at the worn-out group and joked that they looked like a pack of rats. The name stuck instantly. By then, the Rat Pack had become the definition of cool. They represented old-school Vegas glamour at its wildest: tuxedos, whiskey glasses, smoke-filled casinos, late-night performances, and crowds packed with celebrities and politicians. And Sammy Davis Jr. stood right in the center of it all. But while his career was soaring higher than ever, his personal life remained painfully complicated. After his highly publicized relationship with actress Kim Novak collapsed under pressure from Hollywood executives, Sammy still refused to give up on love. In 1960, he fell deeply for Swedish actress May Britt, a glamorous blonde actress who seemed completely different from the women Hollywood had previously warned him away from. The romance moved fast. Before long, the two were engaged. This time, Sammy believed things might actually work out. Unlike Kim Novak, May Britt didn't have a powerful studio boss controlling every aspect of her personal life. For the first time, Sammy thought he might finally be able to marry the woman he loved without outside interference, destroying everything. But once again, America got in the way. By this point, Sammy's fame had exploded to a whole new level because of the Rat Pack and his growing friendship with Sinatra. That also meant every aspect of his life was suddenly under a microscope, especially his interracial relationship. At the exact same time, John F. Kennedy was campaigning for the presidency, and Sinatra, along with the Rat Pack, were heavily involved in supporting him. Sammy even appeared alongside the group at the Democratic National Convention. Instead of applause, he was met with loud boos from sections of the audience. People knew about him and May Britt, and America in 1960 was still deeply hostile toward interracial marriage. Polls at the time showed that only a tiny percentage of Americans supported it. To many voters, Sammy's relationship wasn't just controversial, they viewed it as scandalous. The backlash became immediate and intense. The Kennedy campaign started receiving mountains of angry letters attacking Sammy directly. Behind the scenes, campaign officials grew terrified that any association with him might hurt Kennedy's chances of winning the election. Eventually, pressure began falling on Sinatra himself. As close as the two men were, Sinatra was reportedly encouraged to distance himself from the wedding entirely. The political stakes had become too high. And once again, Sammy found himself sacrificing his own happiness to make other people comfortable. Understanding the impossible position Sinatra had been placed in, Sammy made the painful decision to postpone the wedding until after the election. According to people close to the situation, the gesture deeply affected Sinatra emotionally. Sammy had protected his friend, even while being humiliated himself. Kennedy ultimately won the presidency. 5 days later, Sinatra stood beside Sammy Davis Jr. at the altar. For a moment, it looked like Sammy had finally beaten the odds. After years of racism, public backlash, and heartbreak, he had married the woman he loved while standing at the height of fame and success. But the fairy tale never lasted very long in Sammy's life. May Britt gave birth to their daughter Tracy, and together they later adopted 2 sons, Mark and Jeff. Still, life with Sammy Davis Jr. was far from stable. He lived for the stage. Performing wasn't just his job, it was an obsession. He traveled constantly, spent endless nights entertaining crowds, and rarely slowed down long enough to truly settle into family life. The marriage slowly began falling apart almost as soon as it started. By the late 1960s, the cracks had become impossible to ignore. Sammy was still one of the greatest entertainers alive, but privately, he was beginning to unravel. After the marriage collapsed 8 years later, his behavior reportedly spiraled into darker territory. Sammy had always indulged in vices, drinking, smoking, gambling, women, but after the divorce, those habits intensified dramatically. People close to him started noticing a disturbing transformation. His assistant reportedly watched Sammy drift away from the sophisticated world of the Rat Pack and toward a far seedier crowd. The glamorous nights of Vegas cool were slowly being replaced by increasingly chaotic parties and questionable company. According to stories from people around him, Sammy even traveled with trunks filled with adult films, which became a centerpiece of these late-night gatherings. The parties reportedly grew more excessive, stranger, and harder to control as time went on. To outsiders, it became painfully clear that something deeper was haunting him. And in a tragic twist, even after becoming beloved by mainstream white audiences, Sammy still carried the feeling that many Black Americans never fully accepted him. Some people close to him believed that insecurity played a major role in his next marriage. Eventually, Sammy married dancer Altavis Gore, his third and final wife. To many observers, the relationship seemed complicated from the beginning. Some believed Sammy hoped marrying a Black woman would finally give him a sense of acceptance he had spent years chasing. Meanwhile, Altavis was marrying one of the most famous entertainers on earth, believing she was stepping into a glamorous dream life. Instead, the marriage reportedly became deeply troubled. By then, Sammy's addictions and compulsive behavior were growing worse. Stories from people around the couple painted a picture of a household filled with tension, emotional exhaustion, and increasingly unhealthy dynamics. Meanwhile, the parties inside the Davis mansion became legendary for all the wrong reasons. Singer Paul Anka later recalled one particularly uncomfortable night when dozens of major Hollywood stars gathered at Sammy's home for what they assumed would be a normal film screening. Guests settled into their seats expecting a traditional movie night. Instead, the adult film Deep Throat suddenly appeared on the screen. The room reportedly froze in embarrassment, while Sammy found the entire thing hilarious. His fascination with adult entertainment only intensified from there. He eventually became friendly with Linda Lovelace, the film's star, and according to stories from people around him, the parties at his home continued becoming more extreme. Even Frank Sinatra, hardly known for being conservative, reportedly found some of the behavior excessive. At that point, Sammy's personal life seemed completely out of control, and tragically, the chaos eventually reached his own family. Sammy later hired his adopted son Mark as an assistant stage manager, giving them an opportunity to spend time together professionally. At first, Mark was thrilled. Growing up with Sammy Davis Jr. as a father often meant competing with the demands of fame and show business. So finally, working alongside him felt meaningful. But the relationship quickly deteriorated. The two reportedly became embroiled in a bitter argument involving a Las Vegas dancer Mark was dating. Sammy, despite being much older, allegedly pursued the woman himself. When things exploded between father and son, Sammy stopped speaking to Mark for months. Then, years later, came a shocking confession. In 1990, as Sammy lay dying, he reportedly called Mark to his bedside and revealed something that completely changed the young man's understanding of his own identity. Sammy told him he wasn't actually adopted. He was his biological son. The revelation stunned Mark. Wanting answers, he eventually tracked down his original birth certificate. Under the section labeled Father, there it was in black and white, Sammy Davis Jr. But the mystery only deepened from there. The birth certificate also listed May Britt as his mother. Yet when Mark directly asked her whether she had given birth to him, her answer was reportedly immediate and firm: no. That revelation opened up an entirely new layer of speculation. Over the years, many people came to believe Mark may have been the child of a secret relationship Sammy had with another white woman during the height of America's racial tensions. If true, it would explain why so much secrecy surrounded the situation. But decades later, the identity of Mark's biological mother remains unknown, buried somewhere inside the complicated and often painful legacy of Sammy Davis Jr. S extraordinary life. The final days of Sammy Davis Jr. By 1988, the Rat Pack looked ready for one final victory lap. Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, and Sammy Davis Jr. reunited for a massive nationwide comeback run called the Together Again National Concert Tour. The tour was booked across 29 cities, and right from opening night, it was obvious the public still adored them. More than 15,000 fans packed Oakland Coliseum Arena to watch the legends share a stage again. The formula was simple, but it worked perfectly. Each man performed his own classic hits before eventually coming together for a huge finale packed with playful insults, inside jokes, drinking stories, and medleys that sent audiences into a frenzy. For fans, it felt like stepping back into the golden age of Las Vegas. Behind the curtain, things were falling apart almost immediately. Dean Martin, who had spent decades cultivating that carefree, half-drunk stage persona, was reportedly struggling badly. Even during performances, he often seemed disconnected. He forgot lyrics, slurred his words, and looked exhausted, more than charismatic. Then came the incident in Oakland. At one point during the performance, Dean casually flicked a lit cigarette into the crowd. The move reportedly infuriated Sinatra, who was already frustrated with how chaotic the tour had become. Stories later circulated that Sinatra became so angry backstage he hurled an entire plate of spaghetti at Dean's head, and that was only part of the tension. Rumors swirled throughout the tour that Sinatra's camp was taking the biggest share of the profits, creating even more resentment behind the scenes. Before long, Dean Martin had enough. After just 6 performances, he officially left the tour, publicly blaming health issues. His departure changed everything. To save the production, Liza Minnelli stepped in as Dean's replacement, and the tour was rebranded later that year as the Ultimate Event. On paper, it still looked like a huge success, but the chemistry had changed completely. The loose, rebellious energy that made the Rat Pack feel dangerous and exciting was suddenly gone. Sinatra and Sammy still leaned into the old-school guy talk and playful swagger, but without Dean Martin's effortless cool balancing things out, the atmosphere felt different. Liza Minnelli brought undeniable talent and star power, but the dynamic simply wasn't the same. In many ways, those performances marked the true ending of the Rat Pack era. And tragically, by that point, Sammy Davis Jr. was already dying. The warning signs had been building for years. Sammy smoked constantly, and cigarettes had become part of his identity on stage. One of his signature moves involved exhaling smoke dramatically while holding long notes during performances. It looked stylish, smooth, and undeniably cool. But years earlier, Nat King Cole had warned him that the habit was destroying his throat and vocal cords. Sammy never stopped. The irritation in his throat developed into cancer. Even after the diagnosis, he refused to slow down. Incredibly, many people believed his voice somehow sounded even richer as he grew older, despite the disease silently destroying him from the inside. But eventually, doctors gave him devastating news. Surgery might save his life, but it would permanently destroy his ability to sing. For almost anyone else, the decision would have been obvious. For Sammy Davis Jr., it felt impossible. Performing wasn't simply what he did, it was who he was. Singing, dancing, entertaining crowds that had defined every stage of his existence since childhood. In his mind, a version of himself that could no longer perform wasn't really living at all. So he made his choice. He refused the surgery, fully aware it would likely cost him his life. As his health deteriorated, another betrayal unfolded around him. According to reports, some employees and people close to him allegedly took advantage of his condition by stealing artwork, jewelry, and memorabilia from his home while he was vulnerable. It was especially heartbreaking because Sammy's financial situation was already becoming disastrous. On May 16, 1990, Sammy Davis Jr. finally died after losing his battle with throat cancer. Frank Sinatra had a final beer with Sammy Davis Jr. on his deathbed. Imagine reaching the end of your life and losing the very thing that made you unforgettable. That was the cruel reality facing Sammy Davis Jr. in May of 1990. By then, the legendary performer was dying from throat cancer. The disease had ravaged his body, destroyed his vocal cords, and left him unable to speak. Doctors had done everything they could. There had been surgeries, radiation treatments, chemotherapy sessions that drained what little strength he had left. None of it stopped the cancer from spreading. At only 64 years old, one of America's greatest entertainers was living out his final days inside a quiet hospital room at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. For a man whose entire life had revolved around performance, the tragedy felt especially brutal. Sammy had spent decades singing, joking, dancing, and captivating audiences with pure charisma. His voice was his identity. And now, even trying to whisper brought unbearable pain. The room itself stayed mostly private, tucked away from the busy hospital corridors. Family members came and went throughout the day. His wife, Altovise Davis, rarely left his side, exhausted from weeks of watching over him. His children visited quietly. Fellow entertainers stopped by too, many of them people who had grown up admiring Sammy and studying everything he did on stage. But through all of it, there was still one person Sammy kept waiting for: Frank Sinatra. The heartbreaking part was that Frank desperately wanted to be there. but every time he tried, he froze. At 74 years old himself, Sinatra simply could not handle the thought of seeing his best friend dying. More than once, he reportedly drove all the way to the hospital parking lot, only to sit there for a while before turning around and leaving without going inside. Meanwhile, Dean Martin had already visited days earlier. The moment Dean walked into the room and saw Sammy unable to speak, the emotion hit him immediately. The two old friends spent nearly an hour together in silence, Dean holding Sammy's hand while both men quietly faced the reality that this was goodbye. But Frank's relationship with Sammy ran even deeper. The two men had spent half a century side by side. They had shared stages across Las Vegas, New York, and London. They had defended each other during scandals, survived career highs and personal collapses, and stood together through decades of racism, pressure, and fame. Sammy was not just another friend to Sinatra. He was family. Finally, on May 16, 1990, Frank found the strength to go. Earlier that afternoon, he called the hospital and asked if Sammy was awake enough for a visit. A nurse warned him gently that Sammy was extremely weak and looked very different from the man he remembered. Still, around 5:30 that evening, Frank arrived. As he walked through the hospital hallway, the usual swagger people associated with Sinatra was completely gone. There was no larger-than-life presence, no untouchable confidence, just an aging man slowly making his way towards something he had spent weeks trying to avoid. Outside the room, he paused. The soft beeping of medical monitors echoed through the doorway. Oxygen hissed quietly in the background. Frank straightened his jacket out of habit, took a breath, and stepped inside. Sammy was lying slightly propped up in bed. The cancer treatments had reduced him to almost a shadow of himself. He had lost a frightening amount of weight, and his skin carried a gray, exhausted tone. But his remaining eye, the same eye he had kept after surviving a devastating car accident decades earlier, was still sharp. And the second he saw Frank walk in, something changed. Recognition flashed instantly across his face. Relief followed right behind it. Frank greeted him with the same nickname he had used for decades, trying to force warmth into a voice already cracking under emotion. He even made a small joke about Sammy stretching out his hospital stay for sympathy, the way old friends do when they are trying to avoid the truth standing right in front of them. Sammy tried to smile. No words came out. Instead, he lifted his hand weakly and motioned for Frank to come closer. Frank sat beside the bed and grabbed his hand. That moment hit him hard. This was the same hand that had once held microphones in packed theaters. The same hand that moved effortlessly through dance routines, drummed across tabletops during late-night conversations, and shook hands with presidents and celebrities alike. Now it barely had enough strength left to squeeze back. And then Frank finally said the things he had spent years keeping buried beneath humor and toughness. He talked about their friendship, about how Sammy had always seen the real man behind Sinatra's public image, about the loyalty they had built over 50 years together. His voice kept breaking as memories poured out, nights performing together, moments they defended each other, battles they fought side by side. At one point, Frank recalled an incident at the Sands where Sammy had stepped in front of dangerous men to protect him without hesitation, despite being much smaller physically. That memory alone nearly shattered him. Tears rolled down Sinatra's face openly. For anyone who knew his reputation, the sight was almost unbelievable. Frank Sinatra built an image around control, toughness, and emotional restraint. Yet sitting beside Sammy's hospital bed, none of that mattered anymore. He spoke about the racism Sammy endured throughout his career and the fights they waged together against segregated hotels and treatment that tried to diminish him. He remembered Sammy's wedding day, when much of the public turned against him because of interracial marriage. He admitted that every attack against Sammy had always felt personal to him because Sammy was never simply a colleague. He was a brother. The memories kept coming. The stages, the crowds, the nights in Vegas that seemed like they would last forever. Two men who had spent decades entertaining the world together were now sitting in silence at the edge of death, realizing the show was almost over. By then, tears were forming in Sammy's eye too, and yet, even after all of Frank's words, the most powerful moment of the night came without a single sentence being spoken, because Sammy still could not answer him. So instead, lying there weak and dying in that hospital bed, he began tapping out a rhythm with his feet. It was faint, barely noticeable, but Frank understood immediately. The rhythm was Sammy's language. It was music, performance, friendship, gratitude, love. Everything he could no longer say out loud was somehow carried through those tiny movements. And the second Frank realized what his friend was trying to tell him, he completely broke down. No audience, no cameras, no stage lights, just two legends saying goodbye the only way they knew how.